The human moved slowly through the frozen forest, each step cracking brittle snow underfoot, and the air was sharp and cold, biting at the skin, and making breath visible in quick puffs, and the trees loomed tall and dark like silent sentinels watching every movement, and for a long moment there was only the sound of the wind whipping through bare branches, and then a faint whimper reached the ears of the human, and it was small and desperate, almost swallowed by the vastness of the forest, but it was there, and it pulled at the human heart with sudden urgency, and they followed the sound carefully, pushing through snowdrifts and tangled underbrush, and the whimpers grew slightly louder and more urgent, and there between the roots of a fallen tree and covered in a thin layer of snow, the human saw the cubs' small, fragile bodies huddled together, shivering violently and fur-matted with ice, and eyes barely open and looking around with a mix of fear and confusion, and the human dropped to their knees, feeling a pang of helplessness but also determination, and reached toward the nearest cub, and it flinched, but did not run, and the other cubs nudged closer, forming a trembling circle around the warmth of each other, and the humans' fingers brushed against their icy fur, and felt the rapid tiny heartbeats of lives teetering on the edge of survival, and the sound of the wind, and the distant calls of crows, and the snap of branches under unseen animals became a background chorus to the tense, fragile moment, and the human whispered softly in a voice meant to soothe the cubs, to calm them, but mostly to steady themselves, because the weight of responsibility pressed down like the heavy snow above, and time seemed to stretch endlessly in that frozen clearing, and every second the cubs shivered. The human counted and measured and planned and thought about how to save them, and they scanned the forest for dry branches, for anything that could ignite a fire, for anything that could create warmth, and the cubs looked up at them with trusting eyes that seemed too large and too old for their tiny faces, and the human knew instinctively that they could not leave them here, that they would not survive without intervention. And so a plan began to form in the human mind like a thread through the dark cold night, a plan to fight the freezing cold, to fight fatigue, to fight the forest itself, if necessary, and keep the cubs alive until the sun returned. The human crouched beside the cubs, their breath forming clouds in the icy air, and they examined the tiny, fragile bodies, shivering violently, and the fur damp with snow and ice, and the little paws curled tightly, as if holding on to each other for warmth, and the eyes of the cubs were half closed, glazed with cold and fear, and the human felt a sharp pang of urgency pressing in from all sides, like the walls of the forest were closing in, and they knew that if they did not act immediately, the night would claim these small lives, and the human's hands moved carefully, brushing away snow and checking each tiny limb for movement and signs of life, and the cubs trembled but did not flee, as if sensing the human's intent and determination, and the wind howled louder, carrying the scent of pine and frost and the distant calls of animals that roamed the night, and the human felt the weight of silence pressing between each sound, and they whispered softly to the cubs words that were more instinct than language, urging them to stay close and to survive. And then the human scanned the surroundings for shelter, for anything that could block the wind, and they noticed a hollow formed by the roots of an old tree and a pile of fallen branches nearby, and they began to gather the brittle wood, stacking it carefully to create a barrier against the cold, biting air, and every movement was deliberate, every glance toward the cubs measured, because the slightest mistake could send them scattering or worse, and as the human worked, the cubs huddled tighter, each small whine a reminder of their vulnerability, and the human felt a strange mixture of fear and responsibility coursing through their veins, and they imagined the night stretching endlessly, and themselves alone with the tiny lives entrusted to their care. And the human took a deep, steadying breath and whispered again, promising warmth and safety, even as the snow thickened around them, and the thought of leaving them unprotected was impossible. And they resolved to stay awake, to guard them, to fight the cold, to fight the darkness, and to fight every obstacle the forest might throw, until the cubs could survive the night. The human knelt in the snow, gathering brittle branches and dry leaves from under the frozen forest floor, and every movement was careful and deliberate, because the cubs huddled nearby, shivering and watching with wide, fearful eyes, and the wind cut through the trees like a knife, and the snow whispered down from above, covering the forest in silence, and the human struck stones together, sparks flying and landing on the dry leaves, and for a long moment nothing happened, and the cubs trembled even more at the thought of the cold night claiming them. And then finally, a small flame flickered and hissed, and the human shielded it with their hands and slowly fed it more kindling. coaxing it to grow, and the warmth began to spread small and golden, and the cubs inched closer, drawn instinctively toward the fire, and the human felt a surge of hope and relief, and the fire sputtered and the wind threatened to snuff it out, and the human pressed logs together, shielding the flame and adjusting every piece of wood to create a small circle of protection around the fragile light, and the cubs whimpered softly and pressed against each other and toward the warmth as if sensing that this small flicker could mean survival, and the human whispered to them softly, telling them to stay close and not to move too far from the fire, and every snap and hiss of the flame made the human's heart pound with urgency and determination, and they added more dry branches slowly and carefully, and the glow grew stronger, and the cub's eyes reflected the light, and for a moment the forest felt alive with warmth and hope, and the human realized that the smallest spark could hold back the freezing night. If they stayed vigilant and patient, and kept their focus entirely on the cubs and the fire, and the fragile balance between life and the cold darkness, the human worked quickly, arranging fallen branches and thick logs around the small fire, creating a fragile barrier against the bitter wind, and the snow swirled violently outside the circle of warmth, and the cubs huddled tightly together, pressing against the human for comfort, and every movement was urgent and precise, because the cold was relentless, and the wind threatened to scatter the fragile pile of wood, and the human shifted logs and stacked them higher, forming a small makeshift shelter that could trap the heat and keep the cubs from freezing, and the forest around them felt alive with danger. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of unseen animals heightened the tension, and the cubs whimpered softly but stayed close, sensing the safety that the human provided, and the human whispered, constantly reassuring them, promising warmth and protection, even as the snow began to fall harder and heavier, and the cold pressed in from all sides, and the human adjusted each branch, each stick, each piece of bark, feeling the strain in their arms and back, but refusing to stop because the cubs depended entirely on their vigilance, and the flames flickered and danced, casting shadows that moved like living creatures across the snow, and the cubs' eyes reflected the light, glowing with tiny sparks of life and hope, and the human paused for a moment, catching their breath, and glanced at each small trembling body, checking that they were safe and breathing, and then returned to the work of strengthening the shelter, reinforcing it against the wind and the snow, piling more branches and carefully shaping it so that the fire could continue to burn and the cubs could survive. And for the first time in the long frozen night there was a fragile sense of control, a small, fragile hope that they could make it through the darkness together, alive and protected. The human settled beside the cubs, keeping their bodies close to the warmth of the fire and their eyes never leaving the trembling small forms, and every sound in the forest made their heart race, from the snap of a branch to the distant howl of an animal, and the cubs pressed against each other and against the human, seeking safety, and the human whispered softly, telling them to stay close and not to move too far from the fire. And their voice was low and steady, a thread of calm in the frozen chaos of the night, and hours stretched endlessly, with the cold pressing in from all sides and the wind rattling through the trees like a living thing. And the human shifted logs and poked the fire, constantly keeping the flame alive, because they knew that without it the cubs would not survive. And the cubs' eyes followed every movement, their tiny bodies trembling less as the warmth spread across their fur, and the human felt exhaustion pressing on their bones, and yet refused to sleep, because even a moment of negligence could cost lives. And they imagined the long night stretching on before them, with only the fire and the fragile trust of the cubs to keep them company, and every crackle of the flame, every flicker of light was a promise, a fragile barrier against the freezing dark. And the human stayed alert, ready to respond to every shiver, every whine, every movement, knowing that their vigilance was the only thing standing between life and the cold, merciless night. The human reached into their small pack and pulled out scraps of meat, torn from what little they had, and the cubs watched hesitantly, their eyes wide and cautious, and the human moved slowly, offering small pieces, and at first the cubs sniffed and flinched, and one tiny paw reached out and then withdrew, and the human whispered softly, encouraging them to eat, promising warmth and safety, and slowly curiosity overcame fear, and the cubs nibbled the meat cautiously, tasting the flavor and feeling the energy flow into their small bodies. And the human watched carefully, ready to react if one of them panicked or tried to run into the dark forest. And with each bite the cubs grew stronger, moving closer to the fire and curling their bodies against the warmth, and each small movement was a victory, a fragile promise of survival. And the wind howled outside rattling the shelter, and the snow fell heavier against the makeshift barrier, and the human shifted logs, adjusted branches, and kept the fire alive, making sure no spark went out that could mean disaster, and the cubs whinnied softly when the cold pressed too hard, but they continued to eat, growing braver and more alert, and the human felt a surge of hope, mingled with exhaustion, knowing that the night was far from over, but that they had taken the first step in keeping the tiny, fragile lives alive through the freezing darkness, and every movement of the cubs, every small shiver, and every tiny gulp of food was a reminder of their vulnerability, and the human leaned closer, whispering reassurances, telling them that they were not alone, that they would survive, and that together they could face the long night. And as the fire flickered and danced, shadows moved across the snow, and the cubs' eyes reflected the light, growing brighter with strength and trust in the human who had become their only protection. The wind roared through the forest like a living creature, battering the fragile shelter and sending flurries of snow swirling across the ground, and the human crouched low beside the fire, shifting logs and adjusting branches, shielding the flame with every ounce of strength, and the cubs pressed tightly together, their small bodies trembling from cold and fear, and the human whispered softly, telling them to stay close to the warmth and not to move. As the snow piled higher around the makeshift walls and the fire flickered, threatening to die with each gust, and the human fed it carefully, adding dry sticks and leaves, balancing the fragile flames against the merciless wind, and every snap of a branch, every hiss of flame, made the human's heart race with urgency, and the cubs whimpered softly, but stayed close, sensing the protection and determination of the human who refused to give in to exhaustion or fear. And the night stretched endlessly, with only the fire and the fragile trust of the cubs holding back the darkness, and every moment was a battle against the cold and the wind, and the human adjusted the shelter, reinforcing weak spots, and murmured reassurances to the cubs, reminding them they were not alone, and that the warmth would not fade. And even as snow crept closer to the fire, and the wind tried to snuff it out, the human's hands never wavered, never trembled, adding kindling, coaxing sparks into life, and the cubs' eyes reflected the flickering firelight, growing brighter with each small victory over the storm. And the human knew that as long as they remained vigilant, the cubs could survive the freezing night, and the bond between them strengthened with every struggle, every shiver, and every whispered promise of safety. The night stretched on endlessly, with only the fire casting a fragile circle of light across the snow, and the human refused to sleep, eyes scanning the cubs, constantly watching every shiver, every twitch, every breath. And the wind howled through the forest like a furious beast, rattling the branches and making the snow dance in chaotic patterns. And the cubs pressed closer to the human, their tiny bodies warm against the heat of the fire, and their eyes flickered with trust and fear and exhaustion. And the human whispered softly, murmuring words of reassurance, telling them to stay close to the warmth, to survive, to endure, to trust that they were not alone. And hours passed like minutes in the frozen darkness, and the fire crackled, threatening to die, and the human shifted logs and added dry sticks, adjusting each piece carefully to keep the flames alive. And the cubs stirred softly, whimpering occasionally from cold or from dreams that did not exist yet in their tiny minds. And the human reached out, brushing snow from their fur, adjusting their bodies against the warmth, and whispering promises of protection and survival. And even as fatigue pressed against the human like a heavy weight, they did not allow their eyes to close, because every moment of inattention could mean disaster. And outside the wind screamed, and the forest seemed endless and merciless. But inside the small circle of fire the cubs felt warmth and safety, and slowly their tiny breaths steadied, their trembling lessened, their eyes brighter with the growing trust in the human who had become their protector. And the human felt a deep aching fatigue, but also a quiet pride and a fragile hope, knowing that they had held the cubs through the harshest hours of the night, and that soon the horizon would begin to glow with the first hint of light, and the long frozen darkness would begin to recede, leaving only warmth, survival, and the bond that had formed in the firelight, and whispered reassurances. And the long night of vigilance, the horizon glowed pale orange as the first light of dawn crept over the snow-covered forest, and the long frozen night began to loosen its grip, and the humans stirred, carefully shifting their tired limbs, and the cubs awoke, slowly blinking against the soft light, and stretching small paws and curling against each other before nudging toward the warmth of the fire. And the human watched with quiet relief, feeling exhaustion heavy in their body, but tempered by a surge of pride and hope. And the cubs moved closer, pressing their tiny bodies against the human for comfort and recognition. And for the first time since the night began, they seemed fully alert and curious, their eyes bright and shining with a fragile strength, and the snow around the shelter glistened in the dawnlight, sparkling like tiny crystals, and the forest seemed quieter, gentler, as if it too had acknowledged their survival. And the human offered small scraps of food, and the cubs nibbled eagerly, gaining energy with each bite, and the warmth from the fire seeped into their fur and bones, and the humans smiled softly, whispering reassurances and promises of continued protection and freedom from the cold. And for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, and then exhaled gently, letting the sun rise fully, and the cubs moved and played slightly, exploring the edges of the firelight, their trust in the human growing with each step, and the human felt a deep bond, forming a connection that could not be broken by night, storm, or cold. And they knew that they had not only kept the cubs alive but had earned their trust and affection. And as the sun climbed higher, the long night of fear and struggle faded, leaving warmth, safety, and the knowledge that they had survived together, and that the bond forged in the freezing darkness and by the fragile firelight would endure. And the human watched the cubs move more confidently through the snow, feeling a quiet joy, a deep satisfaction, and an unspoken promise to always guard, protect, and guide them through whatever came next in the forest that had tested them and kept them alive.